Paolo. This divorced man then began to dare to grab Margarita's breasts and buttocks when she was in the kitchen or anywhere else if no one was looking. She refused several times, but Paolo threatened to tell Armando that Margarita had miscarried to make her husband sicker. Of course, this scared the younger sister and she complied with her stepbrother's wishes. After all, they're not siblings, he said. Hey, welcome back to our channel. Today, we're diving into another real, jaw-dropping story from Cotabato City, Philippines. Trust me, this one will leave you shaking your head. It's one of those strange but true situations that really makes you question everything. It's one of those cases where what we fear about lust and its dark consequences, well, it really happened. Curious? Let's break down this wild tale and see what went down. Stay tuned. Before we dive into today's story, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share this video with your friends. We really appreciate your support. Now, let's jump right in. This is the story of Margarita, a girl born in 1995 and raised by her single mother. Margarita was an only child, and life for her was pretty quiet until 2011, when her mom remarried a soldier named Alberto. But in 2016, tragedy struck when her mom passed away due to an illness, leaving Margarita to live with her new stepfather and stepbrother Paolo, who was also in the military. At the same time, Margarita had formed a close friendship with a woman named Irene. They both worked together in a stationery packaging company, and Irene had this tough, almost masculine demeanor. But Margarita's dad wasn't too thrilled about their friendship. He was afraid people might start thinking they were more than just friends, even though they weren't. It didn't help that Irene's behavior seemed a little too clingy at times, like she had romantic feelings for Margarita. Then in January 2017, Margarita shocked everyone when she announced she was in a relationship with a man named Armando. This news especially upset Irene, who suddenly pulled away from Margarita and became distant. Margarita, who had always seen Irene as a close friend, couldn't understand why Irene was acting this way. She confided in her dad, who bluntly said, "She likes you. You're just too naive. That's why I told you not to get too close to her." Margarita took a while to process it, and a month later, she finally went to Irene's place to talk things through. Irene, though, was furious. She admitted that she'd always had feelings for Margarita, and her heart was broken when Margarita started dating Armando. Despite Margarita's heartfelt apology and plea to continue their friendship, Irene refused to speak with her and chose to stay away. It was a tough time for Margarita, but life moved on. She and Armando became even closer and got married in May 2018. Margarita was 23, and Armando was 25. They had a simple ceremony in Armando's hometown in Tacurong City, then moved back to Cotabato City, where they both worked. Armando had a solid job in land and building deed supervision, and Margarita couldn't be prouder of him. However, in August 2019, life threw them a curveball. Margarita, who had been hoping to start a family, suffered a miscarriage due to complications with her uterus. It was a heartbreaking loss for the couple, but they didn't give up on their dream of having children. Then, in December 2019, disaster struck again. Armando was involved in a severe car accident while working outside the city. Tragically, 2 of his friends died at the scene, and Armando ended up in a coma for 31 days. He survived, but the accident left him with one paralyzed leg and serious injuries to his chest that required ongoing care. Armando was hospitalized for a while, but as the bills piled up, much of his recovery happened at home. Despite the challenges, Margarita stood by him, and even though Armando couldn't work, his office continued to pay his salary for a few months. But eventually, the payments stopped, and Margarita became the sole breadwinner, balancing work and caring for her husband. To make things a little easier, Margarita moved in with her stepfather, Alberto. The house already had a household assistant, which helped with looking after Armando while Margarita was at work, but it was still a tough adjustment. Armando wanted her by his side as much as possible, especially during his recovery. In May 2020, just as the pandemic was taking over, Margarita had some bittersweet news. She was pregnant again. Even though her husband, Armando, couldn't walk and spent most of his days in bed, this news brought him a burst of joy. In fact, the doctor even said that Armando's health had improved by 31% after hearing that Margarita was expecting. The family was hopeful and excited, eagerly anticipating the development of the baby. But things took a turn in June 2020. Margarita started feeling intense stomach pains and had to go to the hospital. She hadn't eaten anything unusual, hadn't fallen, and was following all the doctor's advice about what to eat and avoid. But for some reason, the pregnancy wasn't progressing. The fetus wasn't developing. The doctor suggested a minor procedure to remove the non-viable fetus to avoid future health problems. Margarita didn't tell Armando about any of this, fearing that it would upset him and worsen his health. So she kept up the act, pretending everything was fine, and only confided in her father and stepbrother. Unfortunately, this is where things went horribly wrong. Margarita's stepbrother, Paolo, began to take advantage of her vulnerability. Whenever no one was around, especially when she was in the kitchen or another secluded spot, he started groping her. She said no multiple times, but Paolo threatened to tell Armando about the miscarriage, hoping it would make her husband sicker. Scared, Margarita complied. After all, they weren't blood relatives, she told herself. But Paolo had a darker plan. He wanted to get her pregnant so that Armando wouldn't be disappointed. Armando wanted a child so badly, and Paolo saw this as the perfect opportunity to take advantage of Margarita's situation. Margarita, despite knowing how wrong it was, couldn't resist him every time he came to her with his twisted requests. To make matters worse, Margarita's stepfather, Alberto, also began flirting with her more frequently. It wasn't the first time, he'd done it before she got married, but now it was happening more often. Alberto started making demands, asking Margarita to take care of him because he'd been alone for so long. If she refused, he threatened to kick Armando out of the house, say that Margarita wasn't pregnant anymore, and leave her husband homeless. Both Alberto and Paolo were making similar threats, but neither of them knew that they were using Margarita in different ways, at different times and places. Margarita had considered taking Armando to his hometown in Tacurong City at one point, but because of the ongoing pandemic and the financial difficulties her in-laws were facing, she was told it wasn't possible. They were struggling just to eat and couldn't afford the visit. So, Margarita stayed with her husband at her stepfather's house, hoping to get through it all. Then, after 4 months of tension, everything came crashing down. Armando noticed that his wife's belly wasn't growing, and he asked her about it. His own health wasn't improving, either. Finally, Margarita couldn't keep up the lie any longer and told him the truth. She had miscarried again. Though it seemed like telling her father and stepbrother would do no good, it was her husband who was heartbroken. Margarita had failed to give him the child he desperately wanted. But it wasn't just the miscarriage that wore Margarita down. It was the strain from everything else. Alberto, her stepfather, had grown tired of having a paralyzed son-in-law in the house. Armando was no longer able to work, and Margarita's income was the only thing keeping them afloat. But most of her earnings went toward his treatment, which was only partially covered by insurance. She was stretched thin, and it seemed like there was no end in sight. There were even times when Margarita's salary was docked because she had to take time off work to care for Armando during his therapy sessions. The financial burden was overwhelming, and Margarita was slowly losing hope. In her desperation, she began to question whether staying with Armando was the right choice. She thought, maybe a divorce would be better. But her in-laws were also in bad health, and the economic situation in the village was even worse. They'd already borrowed money several times and hadn't paid it back. Margarita loved her husband, and despite everything, she wanted to make it work. In the end, her situation grew so dire that she gave in to her stepfather's demands. She hoped that by fulfilling his twisted desires, she could ensure that Armando wouldn't be kicked out of the house and that he would still have food to eat. To save even more money, they stopped using a maid, further stretching their already strained finances. As the months and years passed, Margarita's painful routine seemed to continue. By March 2022, things took another unfortunate turn. The company where she worked had to cut down its staff due to a slump in production. Almost 70% of the employees were let go, including Margarita. With no job to keep her busy, Margarita turned to social media and reconnected with her old friend, Irene, who was now working in the skincare industry. Irene offered to help, but sadly, there were no job openings at the moment. It was during this time that Margarita poured her heart out to Irene. She told her about the struggles in her marriage, the mistreatment from her father and stepbrother, and all the emotional pain she'd been carrying for years. Irene was shocked and upset by what she heard. She immediately suggested that Margarita report the abuse to the police. But Margarita hesitated. She was still living under the same roof as her father and stepbrother, and, despite everything, her stepfather was helping to pay for Armando's therapy. Irene couldn't understand why Margarita was willing to keep enduring this. "How long will you let them use you?" she asked. "Your stepfather and stepbrother should be protecting and helping you, not treating you like this." On the night of May 1, 2022, Irene decided to visit Margarita's house to see her and Armando in person. Paolo, Margarita's stepbrother, was also there, which made Irene uncomfortable, but she kept her emotions in check. She had promised herself she wouldn't overreact, especially since Margarita's father wasn't home yet. They all sat in the living room chatting, but the atmosphere was tense. Irene didn't exactly like Armando, since he had been involved with her in the past, and she couldn't stand being around Paolo, knowing what he had done to Margarita. The conversation was awkward, and after a while, Margarita excused herself to the kitchen to grab some drinks. That's when things took a terrible turn. Paolo followed Margarita into the kitchen, and Irene, pretending she needed to use the bathroom, went after them. In the kitchen, Irene witnessed something that made her blood run cold. Paolo was rubbing himself against Margarita, who was desperately trying to push him away. Furious, Irene screamed, "What the hell are you doing to your own sister?" Paolo yelled back, and a confrontation quickly escalated. Irene, acting on pure rage, threw the first punch, hitting Paolo square in the face. The situation quickly spiraled out of control. Margarita tried to intervene, but Paolo wasn't having it. He grabbed a frying pan and swung it at Irene's head with all his strength. At this point, Armando, who had been sitting on the couch, tried to stand up with his cane, but his movement was slow and unsteady. As the chaos unfolded, Paolo, now bleeding from the punch Irene landed, ran to his room to escape. But Irene, determined to confront him, followed him up the stairs. What Irene didn't realize was that Paolo, a soldier, kept a gun in his room. When he saw Irene coming after him, he pulled the trigger. Several shots rang out, and Irene collapsed, dead on the spot. Margarita and Armando were left in shock and grief, crying uncontrollably as the sound of gunfire echoed through the neighborhood. Neighbors rushed over, alarmed by the noise. Paolo tried to escape through the kitchen, but by the time he reached the back door, more people had arrived. He was caught and immediately handed over to the police. During the trial, when Margarita was questioned by the police, she finally revealed the full truth, not only to the investigators but also to Armando. For the past 2 years, she had been coerced and manipulated into serving her father and stepbrother. She confessed that, to keep everything together, she had kept the secret of her miscarriage and sacrificed herself to provide for her husband. It was the only way she could survive, to keep food on the table while waiting for Armando's recovery. Her husband, devastated by the truth, was left in tears, feeling helpless and guilty. He blamed himself for not being able to provide for her, not even being able to have children. He had even contemplated ending his life, but Margarita always gave him hope, encouraging him to keep going. Little did he know, the woman he loved had been silently carrying a heavy burden, sacrificing more than anyone could imagine, all to protect him. The lawyer worked tirelessly to help Margarita bring her father and stepbrother to court. A post-mortem was conducted, and a thorough investigation followed. Even the domestic assistant, who had been fired just the day before, came forward as a witness in Margarita's defense. She had witnessed the horrible actions of Alberto and Paolo towards Margarita for years. This became a key part of the trial against Paolo for the fight that ultimately led to Irene's death. Of course, Paolo denied all charges. He claimed that Irene attacked him first, without any reason. But the judge wasn't convinced. As the saying goes, there's no smoke without fire. Several witnesses testified in court that Irene had no history of violence, and she was known for being kind-hearted. There was simply no way she would have started the fight without a cause. Margarita's text messages to Irene, where she confided in her about the abuse she'd suffered, also served as crucial evidence. It painted a disturbing picture of everything that had been happening in the household. On October 6, 2022, the judge at the Cotabato City High Court delivered a loud, firm verdict. Paulo was found guilty of intentionally taking Irene's life, having shot her 11 times in his room. In addition to the murder charge, Paulo was convicted of using a firearm and committing misconduct with his half-sister, Margarita. The 30-year-old was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving at least 25 years. As for Alberto, he was also found guilty of his years of misconduct towards his stepdaughter and sentenced to 12 years behind bars. Both Paulo and Alberto were dishonorably discharged from their military service, their reputations shattered. Margarita, on the other hand, was acquitted of any wrongdoing. She had confessed her mistakes to Armando, but despite everything, he forgave her. They decided to leave everything behind and start fresh in Rangsit, where Armando's parents lived. As for Irene, her spirit had been set free, and her memory would be cherished forever. What lessons can we learn from this story?